Welcome to Godless and Grounded.
There is a strange pattern that repeats itself across almost every religion, every culture, every century. God is always invisible, always silent, always missing at the exact moment he is needed the most. But his rules? His rules are everywhere. They are loud. They are enforced. They decide how you dress, who you love, what you eat, what you think, how you raise your children, and sometimes whether you live or die. God never shows up, but his rules always do. Think about that for a moment. When a child is abused by a priest, an imam, a pastor, or a religious teacher, God does not show up. He does not stop it. He does not speak. He does not intervene. But when that same child grows up and questions religion, suddenly God has rules. Suddenly there are punishments. Suddenly there is hell. When famine strikes, when earthquakes bury thousands under rubble, when floods wipe out villages, God does not show up. No voice from the sky. No hand stopping the disaster. No miracle rescue. But after the tragedy, religious leaders are very quick to show up with rules. They tell people what God wants now. They tell women how to dress. They tell survivors to pray harder. They tell victims it was a test or a punishment or part of a plan. Notice how the rules always arrive after the damage is done. If God exists and cares, you would expect the opposite. You would expect presence before rules. You would expect protection before punishment. You would expect help before judgment. But reality shows us something else. Silence first, rules later. Let us talk about law. Religious laws claim to come from God. But these laws always look suspiciously human. They reflect the fears, ignorance, and power structures of the time they were written. Ancient religious laws talk endlessly about women's bodies, women's obedience, women's purity. Why? Because ancient societies were obsessed with controlling women. God just happens to agree with the men in charge every single time. Religious laws allow slavery in old texts. God never shows up to say stop owning humans. But the rules carefully explain how to own them properly, how to beat them without killing them, how to pass them on like property. God is silent about freedom but very detailed about control. That should already make us uncomfortable. When people are sick, they go to hospitals, not temples. When planes crash, investigators look for mechanical failure, not divine anger. When crops fail, farmers study soil and climate, not scripture. In real life, solutions come from human effort, science, and cooperation. God does not show up. But religion still demands obedience. This creates a dangerous system. A system where authority exists without accountability. If a human ruler made laws but never showed up to help his people, we would call him a tyrant. If a boss gave orders but never worked, never explained, never appeared, we would call him useless. But when God does it, suddenly it is sacred. Why? Because invisible authority is the easiest authority to abuse. When God never speaks directly, anyone can speak for him. When God never shows up, anyone can claim his rules. And history proves this again and again. Kings ruled in God's name. Wars were fought in God's name. Women were burned. Gays were killed. Heretics were tortured. All in God's name. God never corrected anyone. God never showed up to say you misunderstood me. The rules kept working just fine without him. Ask yourself a simple question. If God's rules are perfect and divine, why do they need constant interpretation, updating, excuses, and apologetics? Why do believers keep saying things like that was for that time, you are taking it out of context, God meant something else? A perfect being should not communicate like a confused human author from thousands of years ago. Yet religious rules read exactly like ancient rulebooks. They worry about food, blood, sex, menstruation, inheritance, obedience, loyalty. They do not worry about germs, consent, mental health, child psychology, or human rights. God somehow missed all the important things and focused on rituals. That is not divine wisdom. That is cultural leftovers. Another pattern is punishment without presence. Hell is described in great detail. Eternal fire, endless suffering, no escape. But God never shows up to explain it. No clear warning, no universal message understood by all humans. People are born into different religions based on geography. A child born in Saudi Arabia becomes Muslim. A child born in Italy becomes Christian. A child born in India becomes Hindu. God stays silent while this happens. Then later, religion claims that choosing wrong deserves eternal punishment. That is not justice. That is a trap. If a teacher never shows up to class, never explains the subject, never gives the same book to every student, and then fails them all for misunderstanding, we would call that teacher cruel or insane. But when God does it, believers call it mysterious wisdom. Notice how mystery always protects power. Rules also show up most aggressively around control of thought. Questioning is dangerous. Doubt is sinful. Asking why is rebellion. God never shows up to answer questions, but his rules tell you not to ask them. This is not how truth behaves. Truth welcomes questions. Truth survives scrutiny. Lies fear curiosity. Religion trains people to obey before they understand, to submit before they think, to accept before they verify. God never shows up to confirm anything, but the rules punish those who notice. Look at real-life morality. Atheists help others. They donate. They love their families. They care about justice. They protest oppression. They rescue animals. They defend children. They do all of this without believing a God is watching them. That alone destroys the claim that morality comes from God. If morality came from God, godless people would be monsters, but they are not. Meanwhile, history shows deeply religious societies committing horrors while fully convinced God approved. Slavery was defended with scripture. Colonialism was blessed by churches. Terrorism shouts God is great before killing civilians. God never shows up to stop them. His rules still get quoted. This should force an honest conclusion. The rules do not come from a watching God. They come from humans using the idea of God. And once you see that, everything clicks. Rules exist where control is needed. Silence exists where responsibility would be inconvenient. God never shows up when prayers go unanswered, but his rules show up when you want to live freely. God never shows up when children starve, but his rules show up when women want autonomy. God never shows up to stop abuse, but his rules show up to protect institutions. This is not accidental. This is how systems of power work. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Once you start noticing this pattern, it appears everywhere. God is always absent when responsibility is needed, but instantly present when obedience is demanded. This alone should make any thinking person pause. Think about prayer. Millions of people pray every day. Parents pray for their sick children. People pray before surgeries. Farmers pray for rain. Victims pray for justice. Prisoners pray for freedom. Yet outcomes do not change based on prayer. Recovery rates in hospitals do not improve because of belief. Natural disasters do not avoid religious areas. Innocent people suffer exactly the same way believers and non-believers do. God does not show up, but if someone survives, religion rushes in to claim credit. God answered the prayer. If someone dies, religion rushes in again. God had a plan. Notice how God is never wrong. The explanation always bends to protect him. Silence is turned into wisdom. Failure is turned into mystery. This is not how reality works. This is how excuses work. If prayer actually worked, it would be the most powerful force in the universe. Governments would fund it. Hospitals would replace medicine with prayer rooms. Insurance companies would demand religious proof. None of that happens. Why? Because prayer does not change outcomes. Human effort does. Still, God's rules remain untouched. Pray 5 times. Pray this way. Pray in that language. Pray facing this direction. God never shows up to confirm anything, but he is extremely picky about rituals. That alone should raise suspicion. Now look at suffering. Religion claims God is loving, but suffering is everywhere. Children born with painful diseases, babies dying before they even understand language, animals torn apart in the wild, natural disasters killing thousands in minutes. God watches silently. No intervention, no explanation, no apology. Yet after suffering, religious rules become stricter. People are told to dress more modestly, to obey more, to question less. It is almost as if suffering is useful to religion. It keeps people scared. Fear makes people obedient. A God who never shows up but demands obedience through fear sounds less like a loving father and more like an idea designed to control behavior. Look at how religious rules treat women. Across religions, women are told to cover, submit, obey, stay silent, endure. These rules were written in times when women had little power. God never shows up later to correct this imbalance. He never updates the rules to match modern understanding of equality. Humans had to fight for women's rights, against religion, not because of it. If God cared about justice, he would have been ahead of humanity, not behind it. Slavery is another example. Religious texts do not clearly condemn slavery. Some regulate it, some justify it. God never shows up to say owning humans is wrong. Humans figured that out themselves, slowly and painfully. Religious institutions resisted abolition, then later claimed they supported it all along. This pattern repeats with every moral advance: human rights, freedom of speech, freedom of belief. God never shows up to lead progress. He only appears after humans have already dragged morality forward. Now ask yourself something very simple. Why does God communicate through ancient texts instead of clear, universal, direct messages? Why no clear evidence? Why no consistent message understood by all humans? Why rely on prophets who contradict each other? Why allow thousands of religions with conflicting rules? Religious rules also conveniently protect authority figures. Leaders speak for God. Priests, imams, pastors claim special access. Question them and you question God. God never shows up to confirm their claims, but the rules protect them anyway. Abuse scandals expose this clearly. Religious leaders abuse children. Institutions cover it up. God remains silent. Rules remain enforced. Humans, on the other hand, do show up. Friends, therapists, doctors, activists, volunteers. People help people, without divine commands, without fear of hell, just empathy. That should tell us something important. Morality does not require God. Responsibility does not require God. Compassion does not require God. What requires God is unquestioned authority. Rules without presence work. Religion often says God tests people. But a test where instructions are unclear, evidence is hidden, and failure means eternal punishment is not a fair test. It is psychological pressure. It keeps people anxious. Fear keeps them loyal. Notice how children are taught religion before they are taught critical thinking, before logic, before science. God's rules enter early. God's absence is normalized. By the time questions appear, fear is already planted. That is not truth teaching. That is conditioning. Look at how often believers say God works in mysterious ways. This phrase appears whenever logic fails. Mystery becomes a shield. Instead of answers, silence. Instead of evidence, faith. But faith is just belief without proof. And belief without proof is dangerous when it controls lives. God never shows up to correct misunderstandings. Humans argue endlessly over interpretations. Wars are fought over interpretations. People die over interpretations. God remains quiet. Now consider this. If God did not exist, but humans invented him, what would we expect to see? We would see rules that reflect human culture. We would see silence where evidence is demanded. We would see power structures protected. We would see fear used as motivation. We would see progress happening despite religion, not because of it. That is exactly what we see. God never shows up because there is no one to show up. But the rules remain because they serve a purpose. They regulate behavior. They preserve authority. They give certainty in a chaotic world. This does not mean believers are stupid or evil. Many are kind, sincere people trying to make sense of life. But sincerity does not make claims true. Kindness does not validate beliefs. Atheists are often accused of rejecting God because they want freedom. But that accusation accidentally tells the truth. Freedom from unjustified rules is not moral failure. It is moral growth. Wanting evidence is not arrogance. It is honesty. God never shows up to provide evidence. But religion punishes those who notice. That is the core problem. A system that demands obedience without accountability is not sacred. It is authoritarian. And the more you look at it, the clearer it becomes. God never shows up to solve real problems. Humans do. God never shows up to stop suffering. Humans try. God never shows up to explain confusion. Humans argue. God never shows up to protect the vulnerable. Humans fight for them. But when humans step out of line, when they question, when they doubt, when they choose their own path, suddenly God's rules appear. Loud, threatening, absolute. This is not divine design. This is human control wrapped in holy language. And once you understand that, You stop waiting for God to show up. You realize He never will. Because the only thing that was ever real were the rules humans created and the power they gained from them. There is another quiet detail most people never think about. Religious rules are very clear about small things and very vague about big things. They tell you exactly how to pray, what words to say, what posture to use, what clothing is acceptable. But when it comes to real suffering, real injustice, real moral dilemmas, God suddenly becomes silent or vague. If God cared deeply about human well-being, we would expect clear guidance on ending poverty, preventing abuse, stopping war, protecting children. Instead, we get instructions about food, sex, rituals, and loyalty. Look at how religions deal with mental health. Depression, anxiety, trauma, suicidal thoughts. God does not show up with solutions. Religious rules often make it worse. Pray more. Have faith. Doubt is weakness. Suffering is a test. Many people stay trapped in pain because they are taught to wait for divine help instead of seeking real help. God never shows up. Therapists do. Now think about how religious rules treat curiosity. Curiosity is dangerous. Asking too many questions is seen as pride or rebellion. But curiosity is how humans learn. It is how science works. It is how medicine improves. It is how we understand the universe. A system that punishes curiosity is not designed for truth. It is designed for stability and control. God never shows up to answer questions, but His rules tell you to stop asking. Another thing worth noticing is how religious rules shift when power shifts. When religious institutions are strong, rules are strict. When they lose influence, rules suddenly soften. God's will seems to conveniently follow social pressure. That tells us something important. These rules are not coming from a timeless being. They are coming from institutions trying to survive. If God truly existed and cared about obedience, His rules would not need updating. They would not bend to modern values. They would not soften under criticism. But they do. This happens because humans wrote them. Look at children again. Children are taught to fear hell before they are taught logic. They are told stories of punishment long before they can evaluate evidence. God never shows up to explain Himself directly to them. But fear does its job. Fear stays even when belief fades. That is psychological conditioning, not spiritual truth. And once fear is planted, rules can operate without God ever appearing. This is why former believers often say they stopped believing intellectually long before they stopped fearing emotionally. Fear outlives belief. That alone tells us the system is designed to control behavior, not reveal truth. Now consider something else. If God wanted a relationship with humans, He would communicate like a being who wants to be understood. Clear language, consistent messages, equal access. Instead, religious texts are ancient, fragmented, contradictory, and dependent on interpretation. God never shows up to clarify disputes. Humans fight instead. That is not communication. That is confusion. Confusion benefits authority because confused people look for guidance. Guidance turns into obedience. Obedience keeps rules alive. Think about how often religion tells people to accept injustice, turn the other cheek, obey authority. Suffering will be rewarded later. God never shows up to fix injustice now. He promises compensation after death. That promise cannot be verified. It cannot be challenged. It keeps people passive. Power loves patience. Real justice does not ask victims to wait forever. Now let us talk about hell again, because it reveals the core of the problem. Eternal punishment for finite actions. That idea alone violates basic fairness. No human crime deserves infinite torture. Yet God's rules insist on it. God never shows up to justify it. Believers are told not to question it. Fear becomes the engine. A moral system based on fear is not moral. It is coercive. If someone behaves well only because they fear punishment, they are not moral. They are obedient. True morality comes from empathy, understanding, and responsibility. Atheists act morally without fear of divine punishment. That alone proves morality does not depend on God. God never shows up to teach empathy. Humans learn it from experience. Another pattern appears when we look at miracles. Religious stories are full of miracles in the distant past, seas splitting, dead rising, voices from the sky. But in the modern world, with cameras everywhere, miracles vanish. God never shows up anymore. Only rules remain. That is not coincidence. When evidence becomes possible, miracles disappear. What remains are interpretations, feelings, and rules. Religion often says God respects free will. But rules that threaten eternal torture do not respect free will. They pressure it. If a robber says, "Give me your money or I will kill you," you technically have a choice. But it is not a free one. God's rules operate the same way. Obey or suffer forever. That is not love. That is extortion. If God truly wanted love, he would show up honestly, clearly, openly. Love does not hide. Love does not threaten. Love does not punish doubt. Yet God hides completely. So what are we left with? A world where humans solve problems. Humans create laws. Humans improve ethics. Humans reduce violence. Humans expand rights. Religion follows slowly, often reluctantly. God never leads. He trails behind. Rules remain because they are useful to people in power and comforting to people afraid of uncertainty. This does not mean life is meaningless without God. In fact, it becomes more meaningful. Responsibility shifts to us. There is no one else to fix things, no one else to blame, no divine excuse. When God never shows up, we finally understand that we always had to show up for each other. And that realization is not depressing. It is empowering.